Welcome to the first session of the Gifts Compass certification training in Jung's psychological types. This is session 1, Individuation and the Theater of the Psyche. The aim of this session is to get acquainted with the architecture of the psyche and the place of psychological types as dispositions in both consciousness and in the unconscious. The growth and development of the unique individual is the centerpiece of Jung's larger model of analytical psychology. It's also the centerpiece of psychological types. In this first session, we will review some fundamental terms. We will consider persona and ego versus shadow and soul, outer object versus inner object, archetypes, personal and collective unconscious, complexes, personality versus psychological types, individuation, and the self and the transcendent function. You can separate analytical psychology, that is depth psychology, from psychological types and still have a full and complete model of psychology. But you cannot extract psychological types from depth psychology without annulling the profound qualities of the types and their role in personal development. Just as you could extract an appendix from the body without doing serious damage to the other bodily functions, you could extract psychological types from depth psychology, and the whole model of depth psychology could still function. But you cannot expect the appendix to live on its own, apart from its connection to the living body. Just as psychological types becomes a static typology without a living connection to depth psychology. 5 of the 8 types are oriented to the deepest elements of depth psychology, the archetypes of the collective unconscious. The meaning and values engendered by the archetypes are indispensable, both to the life of the individual and life in the world. In Jung's original work, the types are dynamic and fluid contributors to the unification of unique personality, a process he termed individuation. We can only understand the role of the types that way by understanding them in the context of depth psychology. So we begin our overview of the context for the types, Jung's architecture of the psyche, as he diagrammed it in his 1925 seminars. We could consider that diagram as a kind of theater, a floor plan of a conceptual theater for the processes of individuation. We start this tour where the study of psychology begins, with some kind of functioning, responsive I in relationship to an audience. The audience being the world at large. The German term for that I is Ich. In the English translations of the German, the term is translated ego, the Latin term for I. The ego stands on the stage as the center of consciousness. Without the ego, there is no consciousness. Virtually all branches of psychology begin here with the assumption of consciousness. Something is responding to outer stimuli. As a shorthand expression, we will refer to the world at large as the outer object, a term borrowed from philosophy that recognizes everything perceivable in the world out there. But in Jung's theater of individuation, there's also a second audience, figuratively on the other side of the stage, in there, that is, within the psyche, rather than outside it. Just as real as the outer audience, the inner audience consists of the representations of what Jung termed the collective unconscious, populated with archetypes that engender patterns, potentials, and energies to shape the human experience. We will use the shorthand expression inner object to refer to this other orientation of consciousness. In his initial seminal work, Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant had thoroughly assessed categories present in human consciousness that shape our perceptual and logical understanding of the world. Kant's categories and Jung's archetypes are much alike, except that Jung did not stop with perception and thinking. He ascribed to the archetypes the understanding of the whole panorama of human experience. The archetypes are like patterns of understanding that enable us to navigate the human experience. The consciousness of the ego is wholly dependent on archetypal frameworks. The center of consciousness, ego, would only perceive a jumbled mass of colors and shapes without the archetypal frameworks that enable conscious experience to make sense. In Kant's categories, time, space, and duration are critical and basic frameworks for understanding the world. In Jung's archetypes, every form of conscious recognition is influenced by archetypal patterns. Social relationships, the appreciation of beauty, the recognition of law, the aspirations of religion. Each of the 8 psychological types of consciousness that we will study in this training would have correlating archetypal patterns as their foundation. A person's predisposition for any of the 8 would have an archetypal influence at its source. For Jung, the archetypes are acquired from the earliest ages of human experience. He depicted them as archaeological strata that had been built over the course of human history, from animal ancestors to primate ancestors to large groups, for example, European, to clans, to families, and finally, to the individuals depicted as round objects on the small mounds of family lineage. Archetypes are like instincts, yet not instincts. Instincts tell the living being exactly what to do. The salmon instinctively return to their streams of origin. The monarch butterfly instinctively makes its transcontinental journey. The male frog instinctively fertilizes the female's eggs. Birds instinctively take flight. But archetypes are different. Archetypes frame an experience to create understanding or energy for the experience. The mother has archetypes that frame the mother-child bond, but not always specifically what to do with that bond. We can have caring mothers and uncaring mothers, but the mothers have an archetypal understanding that they're in an important mother-child relationship and can become conscious of whether they are caring or not caring mothers. Archetypes are transcendent. No one has ever seen or touched an archetype. When we review the introverted types, we will talk about the images that are representations of the archetypes, but the archetypes themselves are not available to human consciousness. Let's turn to consider what happens in the rest of the theater of the psyche in response to these 2 audiences, the inner object and the outer object. A complex is that which is formed when archetypal patterns meet experience in the world. The personal unconscious stores the lifelong memories, feelings, wounds, and triumphs of an individual's experience in the world. The complexes grow, acquire strength, and shape or obstruct the individual's further engagement with the world. A persona is a kind of social mask built from the ego's natural dispositions and the social norms and values in the world. To navigate social relationships and one's perceived role, a persona develops that enables a person to relate to others. One of the delightful aspects of small children is that they have so little self-consciousness. They say whatever comes into their minds. They have practically no persona at all. But as young children get older, they begin to acquire social relationships. As teenagers, they learn that they need to be accepted and approved by other teenagers, and their personas adjust so that they might become more acceptable. They accept social roles and positions. Later, they pursue careers. They develop a certain social standing or status and develop personas that correspond to their new roles, positions, and status. The persona has a typological orientation that is identical to the ego's orientation. Whereas Jung noted, The persona is always identical with a typical attitude dominated by a single psychological function, for example, by thinking, feeling, or intuition. This one-sidedness necessarily results in the relative repression of the other functions. The shadow grows in strength as the ego develops, for the shadow is the beneficiary of all the characteristics that have been unwanted or not serviceable to the ego and persona. The shadow will be the thorn in the flesh of the ego persona. It will include those aspects of the personality that the individual does not want to acknowledge. The invisible shadow becomes apparent in the world through shadow projections. The people we most dislike are often the sides of ourselves that are deeply lodged in the shadow, the aspects of ourselves that we wish to ignore or repress. For individuation to proceed, the shadow must be acknowledged and accepted in consciousness. In the film about Schmidt, we can see how Schmidt began to acknowledge those aspects of himself that he so desperately attempted to repress. At the start of the film, he is a proud woodman of the world who paves the way. At the end of the film, we hear him acknowledge, "I'm a failure." There's no getting around it. In terms of type dynamics, the shadow will hold those type dispositions that are excluded from the ego's type dispositions. Just as the ego has an extension of itself in the form of a persona, the shadow has an extension of itself in the form of the soul, also referred to as either anima or animus. The type dispositions held by the shadow will also be held by the soul. Jung's architecture of the psyche has a complementary symmetry. As the persona relates to the audience of the world, the soul relates to the audience of the archetypes. If the persona is masculine, the soul will be feminine. The soul is that deeply embedded element of the unconscious that can throw us into romantic relationships, often with people who have the type dispositions resident in the soul. We may fall in love because the soul is resonating with some projected image of itself in the world. When we study psychological types, we are looking not just at the ego orientations, but also at the oppositional orientations in the unconscious. These oppositions are the critical elements of individuation. We will consider the types as ego orientations in the next 4 sessions, then look to type dynamics in the last 3 sessions that include type orientations in the unconscious. The persona, the mask that is an extension of the ego's disposition, takes its place on the apron of the stage of consciousness. Standing behind the actor is the ego, the central figure on the stage of consciousness. These are the 2 conscious protagonists. But in the mirror world of the unconscious, we also now have 2 complementary and opposing antagonists. If the ego has adopted an orientation of the world that engages primarily thinking, for example, the persona will be shaped out of that orientation. The shadow will theoretically grow in opposition to it as an orientation to the archetypes that engages primarily feeling, and the soul will also be shaped from that orientation. Individuation will be the integration of those oppositions within one individual. In the first half of life, the aim will be to develop a strong and useful thinking orientation. In the second half of life, individuation will integrate the less conscious feeling orientation. This sort of integration of opposites is the central drama of individuation. So the drama of individuation proceeds, but to what end? Who is individuating in this drama? The individuating person is depicted in Jung's diagram midway between the ego and shadow. The unique person or personality will individuate and become more fully expressed as the union of these oppositions. An important point at this juncture is to note that Jung's psychological types are not personality types. A person has an ego, but is not the ego. Psychological types should not be conflated with personality. Personality for Jung was far more important and mysterious. Let's look at some of what Jung had to say about personality. Individuation, therefore, is a process of differentiation having for its goal the development of the individual personality. This something is the desired midpoint of the personality, that ineffable something betwixt the opposites, or else that which unites them, or the result of conflict, or the product of energetic tension, coming to birth of personality, a profoundly individual step forward, the next stage. It is as if a river that had run to waste in sluggish side streams and marshes suddenly found its way back to its proper bed, or as if a stone lying on a germinating seed were lifted away so that the shoot could begin its natural growth. This widened consciousness is no longer the touchy, egotistical bundle of personal wishes, fears, hopes, and ambitions, which always has to be compensated or corrected by unconscious counter tendencies. Instead, it is a function of relationship, bringing the individual into absolute binding and indissoluble communion with the world at large. This is the individuation of the unique person. The terms personality and person have the same meaning. The individuation of unique personality will require the integration of opposing and complementary type dispositions within one individual. The true, authentic person emerges as an integration of shadow and ego identities, neither one or the other, but both together, within the dynamic guidance of the self, depicted as a larger circle encompassing relationships with both the inner and outer worlds, for the two worlds are often synchronized. The archetypal self offers the underlying guidance for the integration of the whole individual. Wisdom traditions around the world acknowledge more than one self, the true and false self. The authentic personality in Jung's model is at the very center of the psyche, midway between ego and shadow. The ego persona is the false self that must lose its power for the true, authentic, centered personality to emerge. As the ego identity recedes and the authentic individual emerges, the persona begins to dissolve. And Jung says, the persona is an obstacle to the individual's development. The dissolution of the persona is therefore an indispensable condition for individuation. It is, however, impossible to achieve individuation by conscious intention, because conscious intention invariably leads to a typical attitude that excludes whatever does not fit in with it. So the ego cannot lead the process of individuation. Rather, the ego must submit to the leadership of the self. The dynamic processes of the psyche are not aimless. Rather, for Jung, they were quite purposeful. As the acorn is destined to become an oak, the evolving individual has an imago Dei, an image of perfected wholeness, that guides the development of unique individuality. Jung borrowed from the Hindu scriptures to coin the term for this transcendent archetypal pattern of perfected wholeness. He called it the self. And here's some of what Jung had to say about it. I have called this center the self. It might equally be called the God within us. The beginnings of our whole psychic life seem to be inextricably rooted in this point, and all our highest and ultimate purposes seem to be striving towards it. So too, the self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality, the full flowering not only of the single individual, but of the group, in which each adds his portion to the whole. The self is aided by the transcendent function, a function that perpetually bridges the conscious and the unconscious sides of the psyche, that unites the opposites. It may often arrive as a symbol. As an agent of the self, its work is purposeful. The four ego functions are functions of the ego. The transcendent function is a function of the psyche as a whole. And Jung says, if we can successfully develop that function, which I have called transcendent, the disharmony ceases, and we can then enjoy the favorable side of the unconscious. The unconscious then gives us all the encouragement and help that a bountiful nature can shower upon man. And here he says, the transcendent function does not proceed without aim and purpose, but leads to the revelation of the essential man. The meaning and purpose of the process is the realization in all aspects of the personality originally hidden away in the embryonic germplasm, the production and unfolding of the original potential wholeness. Jung's proposed psychic structure is symmetrically complementary: persona and soul, ego and shadow, collective unconscious, and collective conscious. It forms a balanced system that responsively and dynamically engages the teleological course of individuation. Until the identity moves from the ego to the central personality, when unconscious elements become increasingly conscious, the unconscious will continually thrust itself upon the stage of consciousness to compensate for the developmental imbalance. And we will turn our attention to those imbalances in the last 3 sections of this course. In this session, we have reviewed key terms that will be important for understanding the relationship of psychological types to depth psychology and individuation. The terms have been persona and ego, shadow and soul, outer object and inner object, archetypes, personal and collective unconscious, complexes, personality and psychological types, individuation, the self, and the transcendent function.